As we wrap up this section, I have a question for you. This is what I said we were going to do, 34 through 39. So we're going to easily wrap up chapter 39. And if there are any questions about anything that we've covered regarding chapters 38, 39, or 34 through 39 that has come up in your mind, we can answer those today. And now you have a choice. We can continue on and look at the Millennial Temple, chapter 40 through 48, or we can go back to chapter 12 of Ezekiel and pick up from there and go back and start back until we get to chapter 34, or we can go to a completely different book. We can start New Testament with the book of 1 Peter. I am open to either one of those three options, but I want you to tell me where you want me to go.
What does Teresa? And what Teresa?
Yeah, and I told her that y'all would say that.
That's why Brad's laughing.
And yep, she said let's go to 1 Peter. So, but that's her vote. But there's all of you that are in the room. So, what do you feel like you want to do? What do you feel like you'd like to do? We can come back to Ezekiel later. I mean, I haven't forgot. I ain't gonna throw the notes away. I got 160 some pages of them, so I ain't gonna throw those away. You know. But we can do that, or we can continue on through chapter 48, which really will not take a whole lot of time. Or we can start, after we finish our discussion today, we'll go right into 1 Peter. What do you want to do? La, 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 la. That's about as far as I'll go singing. Okay. Go back or continue on forward? Okay. Others?
That works for me.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Does it continue to be permanent for today?
It's a millennial temple, so really, no.
1,000 years.
Yeah, yes, it's what will happen.
1,000 years.
Yeah, it will be the 1,000-year.
Well, that's just me. I think it starts and my brother just finished it.
Okay.
That's how.
I have no problem with that. I anticipated that as well, and we shall do that. So, but let's look at this first. As we get into it, we talked about the timeline of the future for Israel, and at some point there is going to be the battle of Gog and Magog, which may happen, and we talked about this. So if there's any question that we have on it, we will look at that. But it may happen either just before the tribulation period, or it may happen in the early part of the first 3.5 years. But either way, the battle is going to result in a total victory for Israel. If you look at chapter 38, verse 18, the Lord says, "This is what will happen in that day. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. Fish, birds of the sea, birds of the air, beasts of the field, every creature that moves on the ground, all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall fall to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment upon him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops and on the many nations with him. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. They will know that I am the Lord." That's going to be the end of the battle. The results of the battle are already decided when Gog attacks Israel. Whenever that is, that will be a total victory for Israel. And Antichrist may be involved with this, maybe through this, as a result of this, maybe before this, and this results in the battle. He will establish a covenant with Israel. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, chapter 11, verse 36 through 39 gives us a description of Antichrist, who he is, what he will be like in truth, although he will pose himself much differently to the world. With the building of the temple, Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. And so that's what lies ahead. Now, in part of what I read to you, it sounds a lot like the Battle of Armageddon. And that's why some people have said that this is probably the Battle of Armageddon. I don't think so. Because chapter 38 and chapter 39 happens, and then there's the millennium. But you have the reading of these words, and it's just the nature of the statements. It sounds like this is a preliminary, certainly. Gog and Magog will foreshadow what's going to happen in the Battle of Armageddon. But it really doesn't seem so. And let me give you a passage that helps my mind to see it that way. If you see it otherwise, there's no problem here, because there's a lot of theologians that see it different too. In chapter 39, verse 17 through verse 24, that is the Battle of Armageddon. If you look at it, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says: call out to every kind of bird and all the wild animals assemble and come together from all around to the sacrifice I am preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. There you will eat flesh and drink blood. There's a statement that goes back to the Battle of Armageddon. And you will eat flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, as if they were rams and lambs and goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan. And he says, at the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat till you're glutted, and so forth. And he says in verse 21, I will display my glory to the nations, and all the nations will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay upon them. From that day forward, the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God, and the nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin, because they were unfaithful to me. So I hid my face from them. I dealt with them according to their sins, and I hid my face from them. And, you know, this is another sacrifice. This is another battle that he's talking about here. So between verses 16 and 17 of chapter 30, 16 and 17, you have an unknown period of time here. Verse 16, it talks about, let's go back to verse 14. Men will regularly be employed to cleanse the land. This is after the battle of Gog and Magog. They will bury those that remain on the ground. At the end of 7 months, they will begin their search. They will go through the land and so forth. And it seems like there's a period of time here, because he's describing what will happen at the end of the battle, but then he begins to describe again another battle. So it seems like this is different. So verses 25 through verse 29 really kind of give to us a summary of both of these chapters. And in that he says, I'm going to bring Jacob back from captivity, verse 25. He's going to have compassion on them. He says, I'm going to show myself holy to them, verse 27. They will know that I am God, and I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. So all of this is speaking of the revival that takes place. Now, all of this seems to be either Armageddon or the Battle of Gog and Magog, which is a separate battle. I personally feel like this is a separate battle. So, also during the tribulation period, and we've touched on this, there seems to be a partial return that occurs through the preaching of the two prophets and the realization from the reign of Antichrist. 144,000 Jewish preachers will arise during this same period of time and being identified from the 12 tribes, possibly led by the two witnesses. Revelation chapter 11. We're not told that specifically, that these two witnesses lead the 144,000, but as great as these two witnesses are, we could see that that's possible. And at some point, there's a uniting of all the tribes of Israel. Whether this occurs before or during the 7 weeks is unclear. Probably during the 7 weeks, but it's unclear. Then a full revival begins with the resurrection of the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, and that's through chapter 12, verse 14. And at this point, midweek of the covenant, Daniel 9:27, Antichrist breaks the covenant, reveals himself for who he is, the beast. We see that in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, where John says, I saw a beast rising out of the sea. This is the same man who kills the two witnesses and whom the Jews thought was the real Messiah until all this takes place. And at that point, Jews and any believer become persecuted. All this turmoil will lead to an invasion by the king of the south, Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 through 43, and then the kings of the east, Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 45. When all of this takes place, Antichrist attacks these nations, they attack him, and they all center upon Jerusalem. Zechariah chapter 13 talks about this. Chapter 14 talks about this rather. And part of the city will fall. There will be a Hamas-like attack. And some of the things that happened with this attack will be happening in the city of Jerusalem. And because of that combined invasion with the intention of destroying the Jewish people as well as Antichrist, in this final combined battle, God comes to stand on the Mount of Olives, Jeremiah chapter 31, Zechariah chapter 14, and institutes the millennial reign of Christ. Questions? It's not clear as a bell, but this is about as clear as I can get it. Clarifications?
Talks elsewhere about when the Antichrist dies from a mortal head wound.
Yes. It talks about
Do we have any idea
one of
where
the,
that happened or when that happened?
yeah, one of the, it talks about the king who has suffered, one of the 7 beasts that Daniel talks about, received a mortal wound and is raised back. Commentators differ on what that means. Some take it as an assassination, which I think is probably likely. Or some take it as that there is a kingdom that fell that's going to come back, and it will be like the Roman Empire. I'm not sure about that. I think it's more probably of an assassination or an attempted assassination, and the man is so hurt, so close to death, he had a deadly wound that was healed, that he comes back, and the circumstances surrounding his recovery are such that the world is going to say, boy, there's really something different about this guy. And I think that's what that is referring to.
I guess that happens during the 7 years.
I would say probably during the first 3.5 or just prior to the first 3.5. I wouldn't see it happening in the second half of that week of 7 years, but probably in the first 3.5 or just before. It just says that he had a deadly wound that was healed, so it doesn't give us a time frame. So I think that's possible, because it seems like after the middle of the week, Antichrist is on a total rampage from that point on. And the likelihood of that happening is probably small. I would rather think it happens before the midweek. Good question, though. Other questions related to this?
Who are the witnesses, the two witnesses?
That's a really good question. Probably Enoch and Elijah. They are the only two that were taken to heaven without dying. Now, some commentators will say Moses and Elijah, or Enoch and Moses, for whatever reasons, that, Moses' burial place has never been found. So I think it's more probable that it's Enoch and Elijah. Elijah is certainly one of them because it's prophesied. Jesus actually refers to it. He says that John the Baptist was a figure of him that was to come, Elijah. And I think Elijah is certainly going to be one of the two witnesses. Probably Enoch will be the other. Now, question that goes along with that, is everybody going to know that's who they are? I don't know. I don't know whether they will appear as clothed as they were thousands of years ago, or whether they will come dressed modern. I don't know that. It's not told. But what they will do in their proclamations and in the miracles that they will perform, they will, as Scripture says, they will torment the world. So they will come in such power that it's going to be easily identifiable that these two men are prophets of Scripture. And probably Enoch and Elijah. I don't know if they will say so. I mean, they certainly could. That's who they are. But
What do you mean when you say torment the world? With the gospel?
with their miracles. Yeah. And the gospel that they preach as well as the miracles that they perform.
Torment to the unbeliever?
Well, there certainly will be torments to the unbelievers, and I think because believers will be living in that time, I think that they will,
Well, if the believers have been raptured,
maybe.
then they're all.
But there are believers.
These are the left behind that didn't come to Christ. That come to Christ, well, after tribulation, yes.
Yeah. Now, the passage that I'm referring to is Revelation chapter 11. If you look at verse 3, and I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So they'll come looking like Old Testament prophets, evidently. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth, which is referred to in the book of Zechariah. Here it is. If anyone tries to harm them, fire will come out of their mouths and devour their enemies. Now, whether they're going to be fire-breathing prophets, I don't know. But perhaps certainly, as Elijah said, when the people came to arrest him, if I am who you say I am, then may the Lord strike you down. And fire came down and burned them all up. So I think that's what he's referring to. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. These men have power to shut up the sky so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesied. They have power to turn waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. So these two fellows are going to exert tremendous influence and power. And now when they finish their testimony, after 1,260 days of this, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. And then in verse 10, this is where the phrase comes from. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because these two prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. So these two men, evidently Enoch and Elijah, when they come on the scene, they're going to preach, but they're going to preach with such power and exert such power that the earth they'll be afraid of them, because they are able to shut up the heavens. They're able to, you can't kill them, can't harm them. They're going to be powerful individuals for 3.5 years, 1,260 days. And then at the end of that 1,260, the beast, Antichrist, he will say he has developed a way of getting to them. That's what his claim will be. But the prophecy is that at the end of that 3.5 years, their ministry is done. The Lord is ready for them to end their work and go to heaven, and Antichrist will kill them. They'll lay in the streets. Their bodies will lie, verse 8, in the street of the great city, which figuratively is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified, Jerusalem, for 3.5 days. Men from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse to bury them. That's how much the world will hate them. That's how much they're so glad that they're gone. And Israel is probably right in the middle of that. They're seeing all of these powers of God, the prophecies, and the preaching of these two men, the 144,000, and now they're at a state of, what do I believe? In all probability, because there will be mass confusion with them, because they thought, they think Antichrist is great, is their Messiah, but these two men are prophesying. They're probably in a state that they're not sure. But after 3.5 days, a breath of life from God enters them, and they stood up on their feet, and terror struck those who saw him, the whole world. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on. And at that very hour there was a severe earthquake, and 1/10 of the city, Jerusalem, collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. This event will produce the revival of Israel that is pictured in chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. This woman, who is evidently Israel, gives birth, verse 5, and this is the revival of Israel. This is not the birth of Jesus here. This is the rebirth. This is a nation being born in a day. Round one. And the revival will take place. And it's after this, there's a war in heaven. Antichrist and his influence, his access to God is cast down to the earth. And then we saw the beast, chapter 13. The dragon was enraged with the woman, Israel, and went to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. They're the revival. They're the people who believed out of this. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 crowns. And he resembled a leopard, had feet like a bear, mouth like a lion. This Antichrist in his rule will typify all of the previous kingdoms that had attacked and tried to destroy Israel. And the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished at this man's recovery. Perhaps it is something that will be developed medically, maybe robotically, that will allow this man who they thought was dead to miraculously recover. And people are going to say, who is like the beast? Who can make war against him? Verse 4.
So you don't think that could be a country's?
There are those who say that it is a kingdom, but it seems to be, the description here seems to be very personal, very individual. So I tend to think that he's probably speaking of an individual who has this. Although there are many people who say this is a revival of the Roman Empire, and that, Rome is going to rise. The Pope is going to be the false prophet, and so forth. Possible, but I see this more as an individual who is going to take the reins of power, and by the things that he accomplishes, he's going to certainly, by his charisma, let's put it that way, by his charisma, the world is just going to say, wow, who can make war against this man? Who is any greater? And he starts speaking, verse 5, he's given a mouth to utter words and blasphemies to exercise, and he'll exercise his authority for 42 months, last 3.5 years. And he opens his mouth to blaspheme God, to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. And he was given power to make war against the saints. Interesting that they talk about the saints, and aren't they supposed to all be raptured by then? I'm just saying. And to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. His influence will be worldwide. Now, evidently, the kings of the east that come to attack him, even though he's influential, they get tired of his mess. They don't believe in Israel anyway. If it was today, it'd be China, India, Japan, Russia. You got a lot of nations in the east. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, all these nations. So they will not like Antichrist after a period of time. And they never have liked the Jews, so let's get rid of all of them at once. And that proceeds, that's the groundwork for the coming of the Battle of Armageddon. And Jesus is going to appear. And it's going to be another result like the Battle of Gog and Magog. Because if you read Revelation 16 and then Revelation 19, there really isn't a fight. He turns the people's swords against each other. He turns their minds against each other. They kill each other. And in his power, he destroys all of them. All the armies that attack. He destroys them. And that's why you read about blood spattering up to the horses' bellies. You read about all the desolation that takes place. That is the Battle of Armageddon. The precipitating events is the revival, the breaking of the covenant, invasion by the king of the south, then the kings of the east. All of that comes together, and God says, time is up.
What's the land for Magog?
The land of Magog,
Is it the same as Fighting Land and Armageddon? Same countries?
okay. Yeah, let me do this. Now, Magog is in this area here of what is now southern Russia and the Kazakhstan, all the stands in that world. There are some who say that it encompasses all of this section of Russia because Alexander the Great talked about the Great Wall of China being the Wall of Magog. So it's possible that Magog may, encompass all of this area here. If so, Russia as we know it now may not be in existence. Just like America as we know it now may not be in existence at that time. I mean, we don't know. But it seems that Gog is the chief prince of Magog, and if Magog is all of this, he's either an ally of Russia or Russia has been divided through civil war. Now, you have Gomer, Tubal, you have Togarmah, you have Put, Cush, Persia. All of this area, troops will be sent to attack the little nation of Israel that's not the size hardly of New Jersey. And it will seem to be a certain victory. It's not. They are destroyed. Ever how Antichrist takes control of this, maybe these are some of the 10 kingdoms, 3 of which he overthrows. We don't know. It just says that there are 10 kingdoms that he will rule. 3 of them he will overthrow. Once again, that's why I say it sounds more personal, individual than necessarily a kingdom, although it could be. And as he breaks his covenant with the Jews, sorry I'm shaking so much, it's just natural, birth certificate things. The kings of the east, the king of the south first, which is Egypt. Notice that in the battle of Gog and Magog, Egypt and Saudi Arabia is not listed. Egypt is not involved in the battle of Gog and Magog. You would think, wow, they'd right be in the middle of it, but they're not. But Egypt will lead maybe another confederation of this group to attack, because it seems like people in this world just never get the point. They just don't get the point. War has been a natural phenomenon in this section of the world for thousands of years. They lead an attack. Antichrist, from wherever he comes from, whether it's off this side of the map or wherever he is here, he brings his forces in to destroy this. The kings of the east, ever how that is considered, says enough. They come on scene. It all meets in Israel and at Jerusalem. And Jesus comes back. His feet touch the Mount of Olives, Zechariah chapter 14. When his feet touch the Mount of Olives, there is an earthquake that splits the mountain. There is a description of the war from Basra on up to the plain of Megiddo, the Battle of Armageddon, playing in the plain of Megiddo. So it's in that area that the forces will bring their first attack. Maybe it's their second. Maybe it's a whole full-on attack. But Jesus will defeat the forces from all these areas and from wherever else they may be sent. They will all be destroyed. And at that point, he initiates the 1,000-year reign on earth that he will have. You have any other questions? These are good questions. It's when you're talking about things that are totally future, although future may not be but a couple of years from now, it's hard to be able to be completely clear. Like I said, I think it was last week, 10 years from now, we could be sitting in the Millennial. What's happening now could expand to a regional war, and with the alliances that are happening, you all of a sudden have a global war. You have a battle of Gog and Magog. So we could be getting into the tribulation period. That's why in all of this that is happening, I'm not worried so much about who's fighting who, what they're doing. I'm looking for, is there any one person that begins to come to the surface as some kind of leader that has influence over all of this? That's what I'm looking for in all the news reports. Hadn't seen anybody yet. Doesn't mean he's not around. But that's what I'm looking for. That's, I think, the significance of what's happening now in this world. In my opinion, which that and $5 will buy you a cup of coffee somewhere, you know. Okay. Other questions on this? These are good. Now, chapter 39. Let me move. Yeah. As we move into chapter 40, here's your outline of the remainder of the book of Ezekiel. Very general statements, but that's how it divides up. And we will look at several things that kind of stand out to us in this. But chapter 39, verse 29, makes a startling promise to Israel. Look at what it says. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. Now, from the time of Abraham on, for one to think they had seen the face of God brought total terror in their minds. The Lord told Moses, no man can see my face and live. From Genesis chapter 17, verse 3, to God's statement to Moses in the book of Exodus, through the judges, Manoah, his wife, and you go right on down the line. Anybody, Isaiah chapter 6. He said, woe is me, I've seen the Lord. I'm going to die, you know. The Lord had talked in Israel's past about hiding his face, which meant withdrawing his favor, blessing, and protection. You're not able to see me. And if I turn my face totally from you, you're in trouble. We looked at that in the early parts of Ezekiel, chapter 4, where the Lord told Ezekiel to put a siege around the city of Jerusalem and put an iron pan, which represents you can't get through to me and I am not going to pay any attention to you. But here we have not only the promise of the Spirit, but because of that outpouring, the Jewish people will be able to see his face. Whose face is that going to be? Jesus Christ. Jesus said, he told his disciples, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Remember Thomas, one of the guys that had, he always asked the question that nobody else wanted to ask. Lord, show us the Father. And Jesus said, Thomas, haven't you got it yet? You've been with me for 3 years and you ain't got it yet? If you see me, you have seen the Father. When Jesus comes down to the Mount of Olives, Israel is going to be able to look on the face of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And this is a natural segue into the division of Ezekiel's prophecies regarding the temple. Now, in this section, we'll see some of the changes to the land that's going to take place, and we'll look at the temple, and I have some slides for that. But we will go into this, and there's particular areas that we'll look at and we'll examine, like who's the prince, and why they have sacrifices, and why even have a temple, all this. We'll talk about that. So it'll be an interesting section, and we'll finish that up, and then we'll move into 1 Peter. Sound like a plan? Sound like a plan. Thank you so much. I appreciate the questions. Thank you.